Good morning. My name is Dr. Carney. I'd like to say a few words about Thomas Hobbes' philosophy today. And I think we can start by uh, commenting on, sort of what's unsaid in Thomas Hobbes' philosophy. It's thoroughly materialistic. It's kind of the sometimes acknowledged but often unacknowledged basis for a lot of what he says. Now, having said that he's a materialist, I should qualify that somewhat by saying that materialism has many different faces. There's a wonderful book by Terry Eagleton that came out recently that discusses the varieties of materialism. But for our purposes today, we can just think in a very simple way about what Hobbes has to say in a materialist vein. He begins with a discussion of human nature. He's not bashful about that. He's pretty direct. Human beings, and this is somewhat new in the history of philosophy, human beings are ego-driven. In fact, we're primarily defined by our egos. And this is in contradistinction to other definitions of human nature, which might stress the will, consciousness. But for Hobbes, from the very get-go, we are avaricious, we are aggressive, and we pretty much want whatever we want, whenever we want it, and by whatever means we can get them. And his exhibit A for this is, how do we think, really how do we think, not how we think people would like us to say how people think, how do we really think people are? And his take is we kind of are mistrustful of people. Now this is important because, especially in the field of politics, trust is one of those virtues which are very important for the study of politics. Societies which have low levels of trust can be equated with a certain degree of civil discord. So right off the bat, Thomas Hobbes' view of human beings suggests a basic fundamental distrust. And it's often enough been pointed out, Hobbes is writing at a time of civil war, and we got to see a lot of his philosophy tried out in real time. And his argument does have a lot of contemporary echoes, as I'll get to in a few minutes. It takes us through, well, let's do a little thought experiment. Let's suppose we were living in a state of nature where there's no government, there's no law, there are no rules. What would that state of nature look like? Well, he says, well, right off the bat, we would have a natural right to take whatever we needed for survival. So we have this natural right, which reflects our basic aggressive status towards the world. We want to survive, and for Hobbes, we have a natural right to want to survive. But therein lies the rub. Because we want to survive, we want what he says, a few more margins to our lives. So we want more power, more resources, more security, and it's a beast that has to continually be fed. Very telling that he uses the title Leviathan to describe his political philosophy. So what is his evidence for this? Well, I mentioned the civil wars in Europe, but he says, look, how much do you really trust your fellow man? If you go out, do you lock your door? Do you prepare yourself with defenses against possible attacks? Where I live around here, I see people with all kinds of manifestations of Hobbesian philosophy. They arm themselves with, what look to me like attack dogs, and certainly the gun control debate serves to underscore how much personal security is an issue here in America. So he does have a point here, and internationally he has a point too. Let's just say we live in a time of failed states and civil wars. They've proliferated since the fall of the bipolar world order between the United States and the Soviet Union. Think of Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, for example. These are societies which, to a certain extent, have fallen back into a state of nature. In fact, the early days of the war in Iraq, military figures were talking about bombing Iraq back into the Stone Age. So, sort of got their wish, but look at the consequences that we've had as a result of that. So, Hobbes' argument is, look, this is who we are. Let's not kid ourselves. And for that reason, and for the fact that, look, I might be the baddest person in the world. Maybe I have a tribe with me. There's always going to be another tribe. There's always somebody bigger, better, and faster who's going to come after me and perhaps take what I own, what I've accumulated. And certainly he has a lot of evidence to support that as well. So for that purpose, and also to prevent our own death. Remember, he's a materialist. He's starting with the most basic facts. Because we want to avoid death and the theft of all of our belongings, we enter into an agreement. Now, this agreement is a device. It never actually took place. But, he's saying that, look, we can infer things that we've never seen from what we see, from what we do see. And we've never seen the social contract drawn out, but we can infer that there's a kind of implicit social contract. And indeed, the idea of an implicit social contract is something that goes all the way back to Plato in his Apology. He was the first one to possibly use that. So we have this social contract, and what's the deal for the contract? Well, the deal is this. I'm going to give up my natural right to take whatever I need in exchange for protection, and for the moral right, or the legal right, I should say, to enjoy my property, the fruits of my undertakings. That's the deal. And now, once we undertake this deal, which everybody abides by, there's no backsies. The power that we're giving to what he calls the sovereign is irrevocable. And the sovereign has to be really fierce, has to keep us all in awe by the sheer terror of his ways. So we have to be kept, on our P's and Q's, because otherwise we'll go back to our own ego-driven manifestations. We can think of Hobbesian world as Wall Street without the SEC. Now we're introducing the sovereign who's going to control this kind of order, this kind of chaos. Now, what are the difficulties with some of what Hobbes has to say? Well, before we get to that, let's think of Hobbes from a contemporary international perspective. We hear a lot today, we look at failed states, as they're called sometimes, or societies in civil war, and say, well, there's certain nostalgia for the old days when the dictator was in power. For example, is Libya any better off today than it was when Muammar Gaddafi was there? Is Iraq any better off today than it was when Saddam Hussein was there? Was Syria better off when Hafez al-Assad was in power? Okay, so there is an argument, and certainly, as sometimes also alluded, was the global order in better shape when the Soviet Union was in power? Now, there is a certain merit to these arguments, but I think to a certain extent they miss the point, a philosophical point about history and the human condition per se. There's a famous scene in Sartre's play, his novel rather, Nausea, where the character Roquint is trying to sneak up on time and catch it as it's happening. It's almost like he wanted to stop time in its place. And there's a little bit of that in this nostalgia for the dictators and the world orders of the past. It would be nice if we could freeze time and keep everything in its place as it is, turn the world into a kind of museum. But unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. And one of the reasons it doesn't work that way is because it doesn't just evolve. The world doesn't just evolve. Politics doesn't just evolve. It also devolves. This is a point that Aristotle early on noticed. So we might have an enlightened dictator, but who perhaps has the global interest or the national interest at heart. But very soon that leader, or maybe they themselves, become a kind of a tyrant. And we have the arrival of the next iteration, which is oligarchies or tyrants or even ineffectual leaders. So there's a natural devolution built into the process. So even though the strongman, the Mussolini, might be attractive for a few years, it might actually be able to keep the peace or what have you, or at least cessation of violence. We know in our heart of hearts that we're living in a fool's paradise, and this dream is going to wake up because of the internal stress. Finally, I think probably Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the great Russian writer, put his finger on this more astutely, certainly than I can. He talking about the Soviet Union and its fall. He referred to it as a moral decay. And that is what happens when societies don't change in the way that Thomas Hobbes is arguing. They sclerose by their own internal decay, by their own internal devolution. As I said, this is a point that Aristotle stressed in his early theory of revolution. So that's kind of an overview of Thomas Hobbes and where I think some of the criticisms are. Also important to note that there's no Mrs. Hobbes in Thomas Hobbes' view of the world. There's no family. The social order does not appear there. And as a later commentator, C.B. McPherson, noted, in many ways, the kind of state of nature that Thomas Hobbes envisions looks a lot like a transactional society, and not like a state of nature at all, with all the implications that follow from that. So enjoy Thomas Hobbes. The ultimate foil to Hobbes is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, about whom we'll talk in a subsequent lecture. Thank you.